Hey everybody, Patrick Connor here, and welcome back to the Knuckles and Gloves podcast. I'm here with my dude Aris Pina, who's of course a CompuBox operator, but also more importantly, far more importantly, history dude like myself. Aris, what's up, man? How are you?
How's everything, my man?
Doing all right, dude. I'm freshly shorn, kind of in a way. I'm recovered though, dude. Was sick for a little bit, and I'm finally kind of feeling it again. So we had to come back, had to talk some history, bro. I'm
A little bit.
pumped.
It's been a long time, bro. It's been a minute. I'm glad you're feeling better. I'm glad that we're able to come back on it, and it's gonna be a good time.
Hell yeah, dude. I mean, this is actually something that we've been wanting to talk about for a while. I mean, it's a little bit of a cross pollination between the true crime stuff that we've done, but also just the history and also heavyweights because heavyweights are always fun to talk about. But
Real
I
quick.
mean, I think that also something that we like to talk about in general is we don't like to just rehash the exact same shit that everybody's always talked about before, but we sometimes like to just kind of go off on our own, talk about other stuff. And I guess you can kind of think of this as more of a just a discussion. Then we're not really trying to teach anybody anything, but we're talking about the kind of lost era of 1950s heavyweights.
Absolutely, man. In all the previous episodes we've done talking about lost heavyweights or the eras and things like that, we primarily focused on the 80s, and those are easy to talk about. Like, look at the subjects that you got there, whether it be Greg Page or Michael Dokes or, whoever it may be. Like, they all got some complicated stories and it all weaves into interesting narrative. But the 50s are kind of overlooked. For instance, for one reason, um, it's the 50s. You know what I mean? We're talking back like going now back over something 70 years almost now. So it's like it's a very long time. A lot of the people that were involved back then have since passed away. And even though there were some all-time great fighters from that era, like Floyd Patterson and other heavyweights around, and yada yada yada, and even lower divisions, it's just such a long time ago that people, especially on Twitter, you'll hear tend to talk about, oh man, it's such a long bygone era, blah 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 blah. Like they just kind of shit on it a little bit, right? But regardless, it was a very interesting time. And probably not for the best reasons either. The heavyweight division was kind of in the doldrums after Rocky Marciano retired. Um, as since what usually happens when a prominent guy who carried the mantle, extremely popular with the American public and the world in general, retires, the next person in line has a lot of shoes to fill. So that's kind of what was ending up happening over here. The last guy to challenge Marciano was Archie Moore, a longtime light heavyweight champion, a little long in the tooth, even though you wouldn't know it. The guy was still fighting marvelously up until close to 50, but still, he was the prohibitive, still number one consensus contender for the heavyweight championship. And then on the other hand, you had Floyd Patterson, young speedster, dynamo, custom auto prodigy out of New York, Olympic gold medalist, and besides having a slight hiccup against Joey Maxim, had dominated more or less everybody that he's fought. And so yeah, that was the two guys that were going to match up for the title.
It's funny because that's often how the heavyweight division is like either thought of or how people kind of mark different eras or whatever, often by whoever's the champion or whoever the popular champion is or whatever. And so you can kind of go through the eras that way, in the especially in the wake of, like, for instance, Gene Tunney defeats Jack Dempsey, and then when Gene Tunney retires, it's for several years just kind of a scramble, like a vacuum of power or whatever. And nobody really emerges as that singular popular or really good heavyweight champion until Joe Louis comes around and dominates for a long time over a not very good division, blah, blah, blah. But then finally, when Rocky Marciano comes about and he's popular, I mean, his style's not going to last. He's a brute force guy who takes a lot of punishment. And then on top of that, he's got a series of nagging injuries. There's rumors about mob ties and, mob involvement, not wanting him to go forward. And then on top of that, the remnants of the International Boxing Club of New York and whatnot still trying to get their hand in the heavyweight championship. And so when Rocky Marciano retires, again, a big vacuum of power, and it left a division kind of wide open. And even after Floyd Patterson, that kind of there's a chunk of time between Rocky Marciano, the end of his reign, and Floyd Patterson and the end of, Floyd Patterson's reign or whatever. uh Even so, like, a lot about Floyd Patterson was questioned to the point where people felt like he left the division wide open, despite the fact that he defended the title. It was often against dudes who just were not up to snuff.
Exactly, and that's what we're getting into today. So it's like back then when Patterson wins the championship, he knocks out Archie Moore in 5 rounds, and I believe you can confirm this. That might have been like a slight upset, right? Was Moore a favorite in that fight?
Oh, I'd have to look. I wouldn't be surprised if he were like slightly favored or something like that.
But regardless, Patterson thrashed him, and that was really impressive. You know what I mean? So Patterson becomes champion, and yeah, like you said, with Customato at the mantle, D'Amato was a very interesting, character in himself. A lot of people, obviously, if you're listening for the show, you know his history and his background, but most people know him more so,
I
especially
kind of
younger.
idolize him,
Yeah,
probably a bit too much.
absolutely. He's one of those guys that over the years have like sort of his persona and his like because of the people he brought to the man, especially with his relationship with Mike Tyson.
Of
Being the
course.
nurturing old guy that like rescued him and adopted him and then cultivated him and nurtured him and becoming a monster.
Masterminded or whatever. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So it's easy to find that narrative, but like dudes like D'Amato or even to an extent Jack Doc Kearns in the past who over the years his character has been made so that he was just like an old rascal who was just into things. Kearns was
Yeah,
like
he was just a fucking drunk who just happened to be there, bro. Like,
Kearns was a piece of shit human. All right. And I think even today, if you
uh,
knew about like people trying to spin it that he was just like an old guy trying to spin yarn, whatever he was trying to do, he'd be like, no, man, I knew I was an
yeah,
asshole.
he had Mickey Walker wrapped around his finger when Jack Dempsey was done with him. That he just got lucky.
Dude, before he died, his last thing he did was that made a declaration that he loaded Dempsey's gloves and all this other stuff. He
Oh,
put it in
such a
there.
dick. I know.
And then he
And
died, and
and
Dempsey had to go
Sports
and
Illustrated too. So it's like everyone was like, "See how legit that is?" Even now people are like, "Dempsey loaded his gloves." It's like, "Oh no."
but anyways, D'Amato, he was very sly. He knew what he had with Patterson. And what he had was a young, precocious champion who, even though he was young, he super fast, had extreme power, explosive, yada yada yada. He was also very small and kind of fragile chin. You know what I mean? He could be hurt, whether it was on the chin, whether it was the top of the head, temple, wherever it was. Patterson got hit in the head, he went dropping somewhere. And so at during that point, when like you said, when Marciano retired, there were a lot of hungry, young, very talented heavyweights out there chomping at the bit for a shot at the title. And D'Amato wanted nothing to do with any of them. Absolutely nothing with any of them. Because D'Amato wanted nothing to do with any of them. And what he did to make sure that they couldn't even snip near the championship, unless there was a guy that he knew was an out and out shot to beat Patterson to win, was say that they had mob ties.
Yeah.
So anyone,
Which, which,
exactly.
which.
So any fighter, whether it'll be guys that will bring up in a minute like Cleveland Williams, Eddie Machin, Zora Foley, Valdez, like list goes on. If you were talented like they were, Customato found a reason why they couldn't fight Patterson. And mostly, again, those guys were the mob. Even though, funnily enough, D'Amato had his own mob ties himself and was, checked out and all this other stuff. So get out of here. You know what I mean? It was just easy to do it because it was still during the era when the mob was still heavily involved with boxing.
Yeah.
When Patterson became champion, it was still before the time when, still probably what, almost a full decade before John Jordan became welterweight champion and Frankie Carbo and everything, got exploded. So
It was around, yeah, a couple years later was when it really started to go down.
mhm.
Like they were already under investigation and everybody already knew. There were several reporters and writers who had written about the IBC and were like, I can't remember off the top of my head who it was who had made up the nickname, calling them Tentacles Inc. because of how many, how far they had extended throughout the Midwest and the East Coast. In any case, yeah, I mean, that was a couple of years away when it was really going down with Kayfabe
Yeah,
and whatnot. But in any case, there
crazy
was a
shit.
lot of moving parts, a lot of shifting parts, and like you said, Customato himself, now especially in hindsight, Man, there was a lot of weird shit going on. Weird shit going on with him and Patterson. The way that he treated Patterson and talked about him. He was talking about he was like sleeping in the same room with him, moving his bed against the door so nobody could get in. And I mean, I whatever. I don't know what the fuck was going on. I'm just saying it's weird. But then, on top of that, when you add on to all of the stuff that he was always accusing everybody of and basically using that as a way to shield his fighter, like in a way it's like, yeah, as a manager or whatever, he did his job. He protected his fighter. He made sure that his fighter was probably heavyweight champion way longer than he really should have been. But in any case, yeah, it's especially with so many decades in hindsight now, we already know that it was strange. It was a strange situation for sure. But meanwhile, there was this entire division, and especially when you look at Floyd Patterson's record, like he was fairly inactive as a champion overall. Like I mean, when you consider his age at the time, and especially the guys he could have been defending against, the Johansson trilogy wound up taking up so much fucking time. Meanwhile, an entire division just sat there.
Yeah.
So one of the guys, I mean, I guess he's probably the easiest guy for us to talk about because we've been meaning to bring this guy up for a long time. But one of the guys kind of waiting in the wings that was just motoring on in the meanwhile was Cleveland Williams. And we've briefly talked about him on another show. Probably, I think it was the Heaviest Punchers show because the dude could just absolutely
Yeah,
bang.
monster. Mhm.
But that's one of these kind of lost 1950s heavyweights. Of course, he's more known for his loss to Muhammad Ali, which is truly unfortunate. But then, of course, beyond that, the next thing is getting pummeled by Sonny Liston because in
Not
both
once,
fights,
but twice.
yeah, in all of those fights, he just wound up looking like physically poor. Like, he's like getting wrenched around and like twisted and flopped around. So when that's what he's remembered for, it's unfortunate because he had an entire career and a really interesting story apart from that.
Absolutely, man. Cleveland Williams is a fascinating, fascinating character. And like you said, Pat, he's most known for being the B side, the victim of what's most commonly known as Muhammad Ali's finest performance. People consider that Ali's finest performance in the ring, the Cleveland Williams fight. A lot of people do. And the reason being is because, well, Ali looked absolutely flawless that night. No one before or since then, for that matter, have you seen that type of like blend of speed and power as a heavyweight in one setting. And kind of the reason for that too is like Cleveland Williams might have been the perfect victim for that. He was completely shot ski. Bless you. He had absolutely no he had no right whatsoever being in the ring that day. Like I think it was almost like a pity shot for him just being a contender for so long over the years that they gave him a chance. He was still very popular himself. But, fighting Ali at his peak, Williams, even in his prime, wouldn't have had a chance. And so, like, yeah, the most famous thing that most people are known for is that famous photo by all-time great photographer Neil Leifler, where the overhead shot of was it the Houston Astrodome, and then you see Williams laid out there like a murder
Mm-hmm.
victim, laid out splattered, and Ali standing over him, just kind of hovered like. But no, a guy like Cleveland Williams, he had a long, crazy, storied career before then, and one that was not want to say mismanaged too much because he was built up pretty well and he had a pretty good record because he was on the circuit like that, but just a guy that never got the opportunities that he deserved. You know what I mean? He had a lot of bad luck come to him, which we'll discuss in a second.
Just a really physically imposing looking dude, good looking guy, a very good looking man, and just like an Adonis body, to the
During
point
the
where
time when you didn't see that too often.
if you were, I could imagine you're looking in the ring across from a dude who looked like that, you'd be like, yowza. Like this is no good. But obviously I could see how that could be intimidating. But on top of that, okay, starting kind of from back from the beginning as far as his story, where he started or whatever. He said that he began working at a pulpwood mill when he was 13, and that's why he got built like at a fairly young age. He said that he was really tall and really built as a teenager. But that's how he kind of got developed. And a pulpwood is just like a sawmill or whatever, like paper or wood that's meant to be turned into pulp for paper. And
Mhm.
so, in the Pacific Northwest up here, whatever, there's remnants from a bunch of mills everywhere. But it's tough work. It's dangerous work, working around a bunch of fucking massive trees and logs and shit. Because I mean, anyway, how you can imagine, like basically where the logs go, you go, and if shit gets fucked up, you get fucked up. And so you have to be fairly strong to deal with a lot of the stuff. He wound up developing a lot of strength, a lot of muscle, and then he also said that at the pulpwood mill, that's where he learned how to fight, and he developed what he called his pulpwood punch, which was a mixture of like a hook and an uppercut. And then he also said later that he developed a boat punch. He called it his right hand. He called his boat punch because later on his manager had a boat that he wanted, so he wanted to knock Ali out with the right hand. He called it his boat punch. But yeah, he actually a fairly interesting thing about him was that earlier on he was managed by a dude named Lou Viscusi. He was this dude was at the time based out of Florida, but a couple of years earlier, he had managed Joe Old Bones Brown. And along with, he worked alongside a trainer. Gosh, what was his name? I wrote it down. Bill Gore. Bill Gore was the trainer. And Bill Gore wound up training Cleveland Williams years later too. But Old Bones Brown was for a long time handled by Lou Viscusi and Bill Gore. They worked kind of in tandem. And so that's who supposedly Cleveland Williams kind of found his way to. He worked his way over to Florida and went to work for Lou Viscusi, and that's who handled him for a long time.
Yeah, like you said, to go back a little bit, when Williams first started working in the paper in the pulp mill, cutting down the trees, stuff like that. During their break, instead of just sitting back and eating, a sandwich and smoking a cigarette like most people, like most working stiffs would do back then, him and Williams and the rest of those guys, they said would make an opening in the field and brawl. 15 minutes. That's what they had. 15 minutes. They go around. They just beat the shit out of each other. You know what I mean? Then go back to work immediately afterwards. So I guess that's where Williams developed his punch. But yeah.
I mean, if you're just like fighting your coworker, I mean, fuck, I don't know. That'd be kind of cool, actually. You just got some beef, you
If you got a
fucking.
couple, if you got beef with one of them that you really want to punch him in the head, I mean, you can do that on a break and know you're not going to get fired for it. Okay. Different times back in the 40s, bro.
Yeah, dude, I mean, shit was going down. It was going down.
Especially down in like the rural South area where Williams grew up, with things they just no one really gave a shit.
Yeah.
But like you said, Williams moves on to Florida early on, and as he hooks up with Lou, how do you pronounce his last name again? Because I'm gonna mess it up.
I'm pretty sure it's Viscusi.
Viscusi. Okay. As he hooks up with Lou Viscusi, he goes on the circuit. And back then, like you said, Viscusi also had Joe Brown and others. So when Cleveland Williams goes on the circuit, he can fight guys in New Orleans. He fights in Miami, here or there. You can build up. It's easy to build up gaudy records doing stuff like that. You know what I mean? Anybody can build up a knockout record, and Williams did just that. But he was also, but I mean, he was not only just kind of going the distance or knocking these guys out in 4 or 5 rounds. Like he was blasting these guys left and right. Like no one was lasting around with him. And even though he was really raw and unkempt and didn't really know how to like actually box too much, raw power and just his ambition and him just being a maniac was getting him through everything. And yeah, he became a hot commodity pretty quickly.
Yeah, he I think I've said this before, and I said it like on the biggest puncher shows and stuff like that we've done. Um, it's easy to dismiss like when punchers are knocking out stiffs and stuff
Mm-hmm.
like that, and it's easy to say, oh well, yeah, of course he's like 25-0 with 24 knockouts, but it's a bunch of stiffs or whatever. And I always say, like, yeah, I mean, don't mistake, don't mistake something, for like, don't believe that it's something that it's not. If a guy's not really knocking out anybody good, don't mistake that they are. But at the same time, knocking out a whole bunch of stiffs is still tough. and that's still indicative of some serious power. And so, the same thing goes for Cleveland Williams and for just about any big puncher in boxing history. You look at Archie Moore's record. Yeah, dude, he knocked out a lot of dudes who sucked. Of course, Sandy Sadler, every massive puncher. Yeah, young Stribling, every massive puncher or knockout record kind of, guy or whatever knocked out a bunch of stupid ass shitty opponents. But even so, being able to do that is still indicative of some pretty big power, and that's what you saw. But then, of course, what winds up happening with Cleveland Williams is that is eventually, the cream does rise to the top, and eventually, as he starts fighting better and better opponents, you do see a little bit of a curve.
Absolutely. And the first guy he runs into, meaning of that curve, is old pro and again another massive, massive puncher, but a guy with an unreliable chin from that era, Bob Satterfield. And Satterfield, the old gunslinger from back in the day, dude, if you remember that movie that Samuel Jackson played in, that's clearly the most recent time Satterfield has been mentioned in like modern times in terms of boxing. But back in the 40s or 50s, man, Satterfield was fun as shit to watch. That dude was just a wild mate. Like, you knew you were in. If he was around today and he was an active fighter, he would be on television often, whether it be PBC or DAZN or whatever it may be. He'd be on everything because he was made for TV. Guy was just
Yeah, it was killer be killed, dude.
yes. And it always was with him. You know what I mean? A massive, massive puncher. Anybody that got in the ring with him knew that they had to be on their best behavior. Otherwise, they can get their head knocked off. But he couldn't take a punch to save his life either. So, like you said, if he wasn't going to take you out, chances are you were going to take his ass out. And that happened often. But when he met up with Cleveland Williams, like I just said, he was still very raw. He was still young. And he had knocked off a bunch of just stiffs at this point. Satterfield was not a stiff, even though he was, on the back end a little bit and he couldn't take a great punch. He was still worlds levels above anyone that Williams had even fought close to at that point. So that being said, Satterfield stopped him easily in 3 rounds.
Yeah, and I mean it's nothing to be ashamed of or whatever. It is something also that we see sometimes with punchers. Like, I mean, I've seen it like the puncher's curse and stuff like that, where you're a big puncher but don't have a great chin. And that has been the case for a bunch of big punchers. Obviously not always. For a bunch of big punchers, it has kind of been the case though. And that is, unfairly in some ways how Cleveland Williams gets remembered. Gets knocked out by Satterfield, but also kind of has a nice chunk of time where, again, he's mostly knocking out a bunch of stiffs or guys who are kind of like second and third raters and stuff like that. But eventually, if you were in the late 50s, early 60s, you were going to run into a dude named Sonny Liston. And there was a really good chance that it was not going to end out well for you.
Absolutely not. And by the time like 1957, 58 rolls around, Williams, like you said, he was still knocking out stiffs left here and there. That's why he was staying so active. But his talent level was raising at that point too. If you look at his record, for instance, he went to England and fought Dick Richardson, who wasn't a guy that was at the very top level, but was a respected contender around that point. And Williams won by disqualification. And an interesting point to show you kind of the weird temperament Williams had outside of the ring. In an article that Carlos Acevedo wrote, he mentioned that Williams was scheduled for a rematch with Richardson, and then voices in his head told him not to go through with it, so he pulled out the last minute.
Yeah, he's kind of a strange cat.
Very strange. There was a lot of like, for all the headlines he was making in the ring, there was a lot of outside the ring headlines he was making too, just for odd things, very odd things. Like that, when you have like, spirits in your head telling you that you shouldn't go through with a fight, chances are you're not going to make it to the very top of your profession. But I mean, neither here nor there.
Yeah.
And, like another thing in that same article, there's mention that Williams at one time attacked his wife with a meat cleaver over some kind of dispute that they had, which is pretty graphic and scary and all kinds of different things. So that's wild shit. But what makes this even more insane is that one day Williams was out doing road work and decided to go for a detour on road work to the police station. And the reason why he decided to run to the police station is because he decided to go pick up the meat cleaver. And guess what? They gave it to him.
I
You know,
mean, when you got shit to butcher, you got shit to butcher. I don't know
I
what
mean, I'm
you,
saying, I don't know. Maybe they're making pork chops that night or some shit. I have no idea, but like, it's interesting that he goes there, and I would love to picture that scene of him walking into the police station, just very looking very imposing, and saying, "Hey, you guys got my meat cleaver. Can I get it back?" And some poor dude behind the desk just doing some paperwork who doesn't want any trouble is like, "Yeah, yeah, here, take it."
get out of here, dude. Just get the fuck out of here.
But anyways, like you said, by the late 50s, he's developed a. He's one of those guys he's a definite top contender. Um, he's kind of in the same pack as the other contenders that they can't really climb above each other because they just know they're not going to get a shot in general, so they're kind of forced to fight each other at this point. Not unsimilar to the black contenders that Jack Johnson basically shunned when he was champion, and so they were forced to, like Sam Langford and Joe Jeanette and Sam McVeigh and such. So kind of the same thing. And so Williams at this point was forced to go at the gauntlet against the most avoided and scariest of the contenders at that point, Sonny Liston. And yeah, they ended up fighting twice. Williams, to his credit, I mean, they were fierce fights. They didn't last very long, but they were fierce nonetheless. And Williams gave a good account of himself in both of them. He just got splattered in both of them as well.
Yeah, and it was the wrong time, wrong fighter. I mean,
Yeah, and Williams' style was not made to do damage to a guy like Liston, who
no.
was like a wall.
Yeah, Cleveland Williams was a free swinger, a guy who he there's video of him. You look at his style and he was mostly a wide swinger, somebody who had really good power but was wide open, whereas Sonny Liston was just a heavy-handed dude and had a lot more orthodox technique and was a little bit more up the middle, than Cleveland Williams. And on top of that was just hard as fuck and not easy to stop, not easy to knock out, not easy to hurt. And it was the bad style, bad time, wrong fighter. And so and you could even see that in a number of his fights after the Sonny Liston fight, the stretch that after the Sonny Liston rematch, that stretch after that is actually probably his best stretch as a fighter, where he does, some of his best work coming back from that. But then, it's unfortunate that he kind of ran into trouble when he did, because, you look, he has a win over Alex Mitev, who by then already had a bunch of losses, but Alex Mitev was a really good amateur standout from Argentina, who then went on to, I think he fought early on, he fought Muhammad Ali. He wound up training Oscar Bonavena later, like years and years later. And he was on the boxing scene for a long time, but he was, a competent heavyweight contender for a number of years. Winds up stopping Ernie Terrell, a pretty good version of Ernie Terrell. He draws with Eddie Machen, Billy Daniels, when Billy Daniels still only had one loss. So, I mean, like, it was actually a really good run overall for
There's,
Cleveland Williams.
there's one fight I want to actually mention during that run that we should bring up just because it's so fucking wild. And I wish that there'd be footage of it, but there's not. And you might know what I'm talking about. It's against a guy by the name of Young Jack Johnson.
Yeah.
Yeah. Young Jack Johnson back then, I can't remember what his real name was. I don't feel like clicking on it, but he was I wouldn't say he wasn't a top contender. I'm not even sure if you would even consider him a contender back then. But I mean, he had a win over Zora Foley. He had a win over some other guys, but he was just known as, there's always just like one general asshole of the division that you just know if you fight him, there's just going to be trouble in general because he's just going to be surly and do something illegal to you and piss you off and just in general, right? You know what I mean? It's just not fun. And there's always going to be controversy. There's always going to be some kind of stupid thing that's going to happen that's going to make you look bad. That was fighting a guy like Young Jack Johnson. And so right away, if you look at this fight, where was it? Williams outboxed him most of the way, and then Johnson refused and stopped over to Williams and hit him in the corner at the start of each round. That's what Johnson was doing at the start of each round. he would walk over to Williams' corner and start hitting him before the bell even started. They exchanged 4 punches before the bell sounded to open up the ninth round. The only knockdown came in the fifth when Williams caught Johnson with a booming right hand, followed by a left hook to send the former California champion down for an 8 count. The end came when Williams threw a long left hook and moved in with a right to knock Johnson to the ropes. But after the bout had ended, Johnson walked across the ring and tagged Williams with a left hook. Cornerman had to step in when Johnson tried to attack Williams with a chair in the dressing room after the bout. So,
Yeah, it was so it was basically every single fight was Bo Tillery.
Yeah. Well, if he fought a guy like young Jack Johnson, absolutely. He was just, and he had a crazy and sad ending himself because I think he got into it with his somewhat. He had an altercation, I believe it was with his stepdaughter, and he ended up getting stabbed to death over it and died very young. So, you know,
Possibly a story for another podcast.
absolutely. It's a very, we've done stories on lesser names than his. So,
Yeah, I mean, it's overall that little stretch from, that second loss to Sonny Liston. He only has one loss, and it's a split decision to Ernie Terrell. And then, so what's that?
it's not a bad loss at all.
No, it's not a bad loss whatsoever. And overall, he's gone through a pretty decent chunk of the heavyweight division in the rankings,
Mm-hmm.
except for in 1964, he has a little bit of trouble, just a little bit.
Yeah, something, and it wasn't inside the ring, you know?
Fucked up. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah. So and I mean, it's I don't know what to say because it's like you're kind of like I'm not trying to go on a rant here, but when it comes to a lot of these reports, and I've had to say this on our true crime shows more than once, you have to remember something. When you're going off of like criminal reports and news reports and stuff like that, often this shit's coming straight from the police. And so, eh,
You have to
do
take with a
you
grain of salt.
do you believe when the police are reporting on some shit that happened to a policeman? I mean, we've already established many times now that it might not be reliable. Nonetheless, in a lot of these cases, that's all we have. That's all we can go off of. Like, if for instance this case, because Cleveland Williams disputed what the official account was for a lot of this for many years. Later on, he seemed to kind of go along with it, but it almost sounded like he just didn't really want to fight about it. But in any case, according to Cleveland Williams, he got pulled over outside of Houston in November of 1964, or right? Did I get that correct? I think so. Yeah. No, sorry, November of 1964. He gets pulled over outside of Houston, and supposedly he was speeding. And this kind of matches with a bunch of what has been said about him later on, because he apparently had crashed a whole bunch of cars and was known for going fast. So it kind of matches. But in any case, he was pulled over for speeding and he was taken into custody. He was arrested. Why would speeding be an arrestable offense? Who the
Yeah.
fuck knows? Probably because he's a black dude in Texas. Um, so basically, he gets arrested, and according to Cleveland Williams, the Texas Highway Patrolman started to take him toward a town that was like known for not being friendly to black people, or that where I guess he would be treated more harshly by the law or whatever. I don't know, but that was Cleveland Williams' account, and the highway patrolman said that that was not true, that he was just trying to take him to go book him or whatever. And so Cleveland Williams tried to run from the car. The highway patrolman grabbed him. There was some sort of scuffle. Who knows about all of the details, except for it ended with Cleveland Williams getting shot by 357 through his hip, and where the bullet like lodged in his hip and shattered his hip bone. He wound up going into like several surgeries, dying on the table, losing a kidney, going through extensive rehab. The highway patrolman had this massive gash like on his cheek and said that he got punched in the scuffle. And Cleveland Williams said, "I don't remember punching him. I don't remember fighting him. I just remember getting shot." But basically, like I said, who knows all of the details, but long story short, he got into some sort of altercation and wound up very badly fucked up.
Oh,
Um,
it's that was a giant slug that went through his body. And by all accounts, every doctor that, all the doctors that operated him all said the same thing, which was if it wasn't for his body and how he was built, he would have died because no one else, like if we got shot by that, we would have been killed. Like that thing tore through his entire system. Like a lot of his insides, intestines had to be, a lot of his intestines had to be removed. I think bowel thing messed up. His kidney, like you said, got destroyed, lodged in all, like it destroyed a lot of part of his body, and he lost massive amounts of weight. His whole frame, his beautiful figure that he had, um, was withered into nothing. And by the time he was finally released from the hospital, he was just a shell of himself, an absolute shell. He had nothing for himself, and so yeah, for a while it looked kind of hopeless for him because what ended up happening was after he did that, the first thing he did was just go back into the streets because less, what else was he have going for himself? You know what I mean? He didn't know anything. You know what I mean? So that was just easy for him. Plus, he's depressed. He thinks his career is over. At one point, he's one of the top heavyweights in the world. A commanding figure, and probably in line for a big fight. The next thing you know, he's fighting for his life. He miraculously somehow pulls through with it, but now he's just looking at his career possibly more likely being over or whatever. But he was rescued. I believe it was a Hugh Benbow who rescued him.
It was actually the other guy.
Lou Visuzi.
No, no, no. So, so Lou Viscusi had sold his contract, sold Cleveland Williams' contract to Hugh Benbow, who was in a partnership with a millionaire named Bud Adams.
Okay.
And so Bud Adams was like, he was some magnate who was, independently wealthy or whatever. And he had obviously taken some sort of investment interest in Cleveland Williams' career, but also it sounded like he had some sort of soft spot for him, and also kind of like, uh, went above and beyond to take care of him. And it was supposedly Cleveland Williams was in a kind of like charity hospital or something like that, and they moved him. Bud Adams helped pay to move him to a specialty hospital, and that's where he wound up being taken care of by a doctor who just so happened to be a friend of his, Cleveland Williams, a dude that he knew. Where from, I have no idea. But that was the doctor who had said, if Cleveland Williams weren't in such great shape and all this type of stuff. I have no, he said something about his abdominal wall being 3 times as thick. I don't even know if that's possible. But the point is that, like, I do believe, like, the shape that he was in, yeah, there's no question that because he was in such good shape, that's a primary factor in the fact that he fucking was able to get through an injury that would have killed a whole lot of other people. But it was this also involvement that wound up this Hugh Benbow guy. The guy was basically just a Texas con artist who was taking advantage and had kind of slithered his way into a partnership with the other guy who was the actual rich fucking guy. This dude was like a cattle rancher slash like laboring, guy. I don't even know what the fuck else he was. Hugh Benbow was getting sued by Shell and another oil company for stealing oil maps. Yeah, so the dude was just a con man. But in any case, this association, Bud Adams and Hugh Benbow, who had bought Cleveland Williams' contract, that wound up being fortuitous and also kind of biting Cleveland Williams in the ass, because Cleveland Williams came back from this injury. And despite the fact that, given all the circumstances and everything and how it was reported, you would probably think that he would not be very well liked, or see people would be like, oh, he's a villain. But he apparently was, cheered and shit when he came back and was making public appearances after he recovered. So he had kind of worked his way back to getting a shot at Muhammad Ali, and that's where this kind of that association comes, unfortunately, full circle.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, Williams ends up, he gets rescued from the streets. He builds back his body somehow into some, close enough to a resemblance of what he once was. I mean, clearly he's going to be a shell of his former self. He's never going to be the fighter he once was. And like I said at the beginning of this, that being said, had he fought Ali at his very best, he might have lasted a couple of more rounds, but the result would have been the same. He still would have got splattered. But that being said, it was, credit to him that he was able to come back that much and, to build himself up to fight Ali. And it was a massacre. It absolutely was. Ali splattered him, just knocked him around. First round, um, Ali beat the shit out of him badly. Just came out and Williams is trying Ali moving, moving, but once Ali started rolling, Williams couldn't block a punch. You can just see he's bewildered by the speed of what he's experienced because he's never seen anything like this. Gets dropped hard, and if it wasn't for the bell saving him, he would have been knocked out in the first round. Because at the very end of it, Ali hits him with a beautiful combination, pop, 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 but that's when you see Williams splayed out like that, you know. His poor cornerman just grab him and just drag him to the corner while he's like half unconscious right there. And they should, like, if that happened today, it would have been right then and there, it would have been over. But he goes a couple of more rounds before the massacre is finally stopped. But still, that's not the end of his career. And he still fights high profile guys. He ends up fighting another knockout artist who was on during that time was knocking the hell out of everybody left and right, Mac Foster, who in turn knocked him out twice. Fought Jack O'Halloran. And in a fight you sent me recently, Pat, very late in his career, in 1971, he fights George Chuvalo, which was on the I forgot what the undercard of that was, but fights Chuvalo, and that was a hell of a fucking banger.
I know, dude. Every so often, I mean, we're just kind of sick, is what it is. So, like,
Mm-hmm.
don't get me wrong here. It's not about like, oh, I've seen so much. It's like I'm fucking sick, and I've seen so much. Okay, but like every so often, there'll be some fight from 50 years ago or whatever that I just haven't seen, and I'm like, oh shit, this is a motherfucking banger, and that was one of them.
Totally. And for Williams, by 1971, who was beyond washed. I mean, this is a guy who came
Yeah,
back
that
from.
7 years after he was
Yes.
already like, according to people, trash by, taken out by Muhammad Ali. This is 7 years after that.
And not only that, his career started around 1950, 1949. All right. Even though you're knocking out a bunch of stiffs left and right, you're still fighting all the way back then. Like, this is a long career he's had.
Yeah, at
You
this
know?
point, he looks like your uncle at a fucking family reunion, far
Yeah.
too many beers in. Like that's just,
I
that's
mean,
just
he's
his
still,
look
he's still in
now.
shape. He's still in shape, and you still know that he can probably kick a lot of ass, but you
Right.
just know he's
Like
just,
that uncle will still fuck you up. I'm just
yeah,
saying he looks like, you know.
exactly.
Yeah.
Anybody that's young and scrap is probably going to take Unk out. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, in the fact that he was still even getting a win over Terry Daniels, dude, in 1972, Roberto Davila. I mean, these are like, they're not like great fighters or anything, but they're names.
It is, yeah. I mean, Terry Daniels, poor guy. He probably shouldn't have even been in boxing. I think he was a college graduate and made it enough that he was able to fight Joe Frazier the day before the Super Bowl and get creamed really badly. But his career took a massive, massive nosedive after that, and I think that contributed to his later issues in life. But yeah,
Yeah. It's crazy too because the Ali fight had its own brief saga or whatever because Cleveland Williams wound up only making about 7 grand from the
that's
Ali
right.
fight.
Yeah, he got jacked really badly from that. Jacked really badly in that.
Well, and I mean it's kind of like you feel shitty, dude, because you could kind of see both sides of it. According to Bud Adams, the millionaire guy, he had basically said, I'm charging Cleveland Williams for the medical bills because I got stuck with medical bills and a whole bunch of other shit. Because according to him, he had paid him like an allowance and bought him cars that he had wrecked and all sorts of other shit. So he's basically like, dude, you owe me like 30 grand. And then also because he had gotten the big payday from the Ali fight, a chunk of that got taken for taxes. And then he basically also got bilked by the fucking by the other dude, Hugh Benbow. And then on top of that, after the fight, he also said that basically I mean, sorry, some of it kind of goes a little before the fight because the story's funny, and it's exactly how you might think it would be. The Sports Illustrated issue immediately before the Ali fight, they're like, Hugh Benbow, he's this guy with a great idea. He's a businessman. He's a go-getter. He's a fucking this. He's a that. And they're like describing what his business or whatever is down in Texas. And they're saying that on his ranch, what he plans to have is this heavyweight factory where he's putting out fucking ads in the ring, and he's saying, heavyweights, hey, come live on my ranch, work my ranch. You can get paid to work my ranch, and also you can spar each other and train with each other, and we'll fucking turn this into a jamboree of fucking heavyweights. And but then like you're thinking about it and you're like, wait, what? They're saying that they're going to be putting together TV cabinets and also, bro, this sounds like a fucking sweatshop. Like, what the fuck? But they're
One
making
guy
it,
did take the one guy did take the bait though.
well, and they're making it sound great. And then the issue of Sports Illustrated immediately after the fight, they're like, this guy's a crook. We knew it the whole time. He's trying to screw over Cleveland Williams. And Cleveland Williams is like, yeah, I was basically living in a tent on this guy's property and fucking like working as a fucking field hand for something like 40 cents a day or some shit like that. And I was like, living in a tent and having to just eat some fucking gruel.
Oh
And
yeah.
basically, it's
I
just.
wonder if he was living with Dave Ziglowitz because then that's what I was gonna say. Then Ziglowitz was the one that answered the ad in the ring because he had
So,
first.
according to Cleveland Williams, there were several fighters who answered the ads, but that none of them wound up staying because they were all just like, what the fuck is this? But that it was apparently not that far from where Cleveland Williams was actually from, like where his house was. And so he was kind of just like, okay, and went along with it. And so I don't mean to like laugh at him or like laugh at the fact that somebody's getting taken advantage of. I'm mostly laughing at the fact that it was like he was praised beforehand, shitting on him afterward. But the bottom line is that he did wind up getting screwed. Especially when you add it all up later, he made a lot of these people fucking a lot of money, dude. He wound up with pretty much nothing.
Yeah, and it's sad too, man. Because after his career ended, he struggled a lot in life. Like he held jobs and he did what he always knew how to do. Like there were a couple of articles about him in the early '80s ring magazines, documenting catching up with him. And the thing about the what's interesting about those articles, not just about Cleveland Williams, but in particular, is that a lot of those articles back then they would profile guys like Cleveland Williams, plus Billy Fox, um, the old 1920s middleweight champion Johnny Wilson is another one I remember. They would profile a lot of these guys. George Sugar, George Sugar Costner was another one. But they would have these, catch up with them, interview them, talk about that, yada yada yada. And a lot of these guys would disappear off the face of the earth after this, and you wouldn't really know what the hell happened to them. For instance, the most glaring one probably would be Billy Fox. You can't. I mean, I'm assuming he's been dead for years because he'd be over 100 now. But like, you couldn't find anything on him after that interview in the ring from like 1980, 1981. He just completely dropped off. Um,
There have been so many fighters where I've looked up where like I'm like, what happened to that? And there's
oh yeah,
nothing.
nothing, completely nothing. So, but Cleveland Williams was another one. I mean, he didn't drop off the face of the earth. People always, he'd surface here and there or whatever, but like you didn't hear anything about him for a number of years. He was just living. Don't know if he was living well or whatever, but he was just out there until finally, when I was young, still relatively young. That's the last time I heard about was when he ended up in the then he passed away. I think it was in the late '90s, and I think that was an unfortunate one too. He got like hit by a car, something happened like that, something sketchy. But he, kind of died under unfortunate circumstances.
Yeah, man. I mean, especially given how long he fought.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he had a long, tough life. That was just a guy that was gonna have a long life, and considering how he grew up and everything like that, you just kind of knew the cards were going to be stacked against him, and him reaching the heights that he don't know if he was ever going to reach them, but like the heights that he hoped to reach, it just wasn't going to happen. And that being said, we covered his career. Had he fought Patterson, how do you think that would have turned out? Prime Cleveland Williams, we're talking early mid 50s, you know, before the
Yeah.
fights.
like if he would have fought if Floyd Patterson would have fought Cleveland Williams instead of Archie Moore, for instance, like for the title, like just,
Well,
around that time, man, I don't know. Cause I mean, Floyd's defense was not great.
true.
And on top of that, he seemed to be really vulnerable. He kind of just would, he wasn't even like bobbing and weaving and dipping like with a purpose a lot of the time. He was just not even looking. He was like,
Yeah.
doing
Just
that
pop
shit.
up and leap at you. Yeah.
And that's just death against like a wide swinging puncher. You know what I mean? Like that's just asking for it. But I mean, I'd probably go with Floyd just because he was the better fighter. But at the
Yeah.
same time, that could have been bad. That could have been bad for him.
It could have been. I mean, it would have been a really fun fight, and Patterson definitely would have had to come off the deck probably more than once before he had to finish him. And I
Yeah,
don't think the fight would have lasted more than 5 rounds either way because then both of them were just free swinging maniacs. But it would have been fun while it lasted. But I kind of agree with it. I think Patterson ended up would have beaten him. But we had Customato there to make sure that would never, ever, ever happen. So
pretty much. Yeah, and who's in your estimation another kind of lost 50s heavyweight, or maybe
I
somebody
mean,
that Cuss really didn't want him fighting?
if you want to, talk about something like that, you have to bring up Eddie Machen. Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. Eddie Machen's one of those guys who, especially when you look through like the rankings and how long he was in the rankings and stuff like that, it's kind of just like, what, where, what, where did he go?
All out contender, a guy that was undefeated for a number of years, and it was like he was kind of under the radar because like a dude like him, Machen was just very he wasn't exciting. That's the best way to put it. He just was not a very exciting fighter whatsoever. You know what I mean? He kind of lulled you to sleep, but I mean, he was very competent. Like he was an excellent boxer and good moves, and if he had good power too. All right, he could surprise you, but he just wasn't a guy that he always kind of stood just neutral and like in that type of gear. If you forced him to fight, he could fight. And if he felt in the mood for whatever reason that he was like inclined to pounce on you, he could be really impressive because he did, have a killer instinct when he wanted to. But for the most part, he was just a really, really solid, foundationally well boxer that was just, always on the cusp of really breaking through and making it to the very top, but something was always holding him back. You know what I mean? First off, being a part of that era certainly wasn't going to help because he was one of the top guys of that era that you knew was going to be a pain in the ass to fight him. And, Customato saw the writing on the wall fighting him too, that just wouldn't be an easy fight for him. And knowing who Machen was aligned with, even though it wasn't might have been not that mob tied, D'Amato was going to put him in that group regardless. And he also, I think, tried to use the excuse saying, "Oh, he has a boring style. Who's going to want to watch that type thing?" So
Yeah, he was. There's actually on his Wikipedia entry or whatever on BoxRec, there's a couple of chunks from the ring that are pretty good, that are pretty good summations or whatever summaries of Eddie Machen and his career and his start in boxing. Like he was similar to Ken Norton. He was
yeah,
like an athletic kid who had gone through several sports and was really talented, but then boxing had run in his family, and so he had gotten into boxing and became a pretty good amateur and just kind of stuck it out and became a pro and turned pro. But like, yeah, like you had said, a lot of what we're talking about today, a lot about what we're talking about with a lot of these eras of fighters is just timing. The timing for when they come along or get going, or who they get hooked up with or managed by, promoted by, etc. I mean, not promoted by as much during this time, but in any case, yeah. We talked earlier about the fact that this is kind of like in the post Marciano era, and that a lot of the US public is still looking for a replacement or a dominant heavyweight or something like that. And on top of that, they're generally not going to be looking for somebody who's a stylist or somebody who's a boxer puncher, somebody who's an efficient fighter. They want excitement. And
yeah,
I guess, on some level, Floyd Patterson did offer that. He punched wide. You know, he had good punching power and could knock most fighters out, but he would also get knocked down fairly frequently, which was exciting. And like you said, Eddie Machen was just not really that kind of fighter.
He wasn't, but I mean, at the same time, he was just a really, really good fighter, just a solid individual, man. And he was matched well up early on. It wasn't a guy like Cleveland Williams who went on, like I said, went on the Cracker Barrel circuit and just knocked a bunch of stiffs around left and right. You know, Machen, his first year as a pro, yes, he just fought a few guys here and there, but like by the time in late 1955, and this is still his first year, he's fighting guys like Howard King, who was a competent pro and been around the block for a while, and he dominated him. By 1956, he's fighting Julio Medeiros and Nino Valdez. Julio Medeiros is known for knocking the hell out of Roland Lastarza. That was featured on the 30 Great One Punch Knockout video, and he also had a controversial knockout over all-time great light heavyweight Harold Johnson, where I think Johnson claimed he was poisoned by a bad orange or some shit before the fight. But regardless, Julio Medeiros knocked him out, and he didn't have a great record, but that was a good win on his record. That was a good win by him. And then he also beat Nino Valdez, another fighter who was heavily avoided during that era. And that was the first time he fought Valdez. So these are like tough tough either gatekeeper fringe contenders or top contenders he's already going in the ring with at an advanced age early on now. Like he had a good amateur career, but like he's being like moved pretty rapidly. So you move on, he's fighting Julio Medeiros again. Now he's fighting guys like Johnny Summerlin and former light heavyweight champion Joey Maxim. And Maxim by 1957 is on the back end of his career, and he's more so of an opponent than he is like a guy that's going to be a top contender. But
Yeah.
like
Especially, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but especially at the time and given the size, because he's not a heavyweight and he's not a big puncher at light heavyweight either.
but being light heavyweight champion brought no money back then, unless he was going to fight somebody like Sugar Ray Robinson. So most light heavyweight champions always wanted to jump in and try to, tiptoe their way to fight heavyweights. And some really get their asses kicked because of it. Gus Lesnovich, when he tried to challenge Ezra Charles and hosts of others before him. And then as Maxim tried to do the same thing, Ezra Charles beat his ass a few times. And the only one he had success with was Floyd Patterson, who was more of a light heavyweight than even Maxim was, I would suppose. Yep. So, but still, these are all big wins these are all like really good wins that he has. You know what I mean? He beats Bob Baker and he goes on and on. And like he's not dominating these guys and knocking them out, but he's beating them, pretty comprehensively. So by 1957, as he's being proven now as one of the top contenders for Patterson, he fights a Patterson holdover, Tommy Hurricane Jackson. And Tommy Hurricane Jackson is another wild personality from the era, just a complete eccentric, a fun fighter, with a windmill style, who didn't know how to block a punch if his life depended on it. But
yeah, is a perfect nickname for him.
Oh yeah, completely. Yeah, and he was nuts too, man. Like he has the craziest excuse for why he didn't like blocking punches. The man actually said, "I like to get hit. It makes me feel good and strong." So, and if you watch his two fights with Floyd Patterson, he must have been absolutely feeling euphoric because Patterson was hitting him like a fucking heavy bag. You know what I mean? Just boom, 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 with hooks and uppercuts and hooks and right hands, boom, 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 or just like you couldn't miss him. Jackson, whatever. And by the time Eddie Machen fought him in 1957, Jackson was, cooked. So he gets beaten, battered, and that's one of the few times Machen really shows himself to be like, I was talking about the killer instinct of him. All that being said now, we're moving into early 1958. He's going to be matched up with Zora Foley, another super top contender. This is on television. These are the two top guys, besides Sonny Liston, obviously, who should, whoever wins this fight will be the consensus number one to challenge Patterson, at least in the eyes of the public and the press and everybody else like that. Then this is a big, this is just a big event. Like if this fight was happening today, this would definitely, I don't know if it would headline a pay-per-view, but knowing today's market, it might. There'd be a chance they try to find a way to finagle on some bullshit, you know what I
mean? Yeah. I can pretty much guarantee it'd be a pay-per-view.
You think so? Yeah, probably, right? As opposed to just being like a Showtime main event.
Yeah, it would at least be a championship boxing, and
Yeah,
neither of them's a champion, but it would at least be.
definitely would have been.
Uh,
Yeah, totally, totally. And that would have been a big fight. But all that being said, it's a big event for both of them, and they both end up laying a fucking egg in that fight. Like it was not good, you know. Um, both guys are tentative counter punchers to begin with, and it just bad mix of styles. They didn't really want to go on each other, and
yeah,
it was
I don't
not.
know what it was about the Cow Palace and Daly City, bro, but for like about like 7, 8 years, they were holding events at this joint. All the fucking like Ezra Charles fought, a whole bunch of fucking people fought there. I think Joe Lewis fought there at one point. I don't know what the fuck was going on with the Cow Palace, dude, but motherfuckers were going there all the time during the 50s shit. But yeah, it was not good. It was not a good look for either Zora Foley or Eddie Machen in that fight.
And it wasn't. And that was the biggest platform that they could have been on at that point, besides fighting for the title, where they can prove themselves that it had one of them like really, brought their A game and dominated the other, which could have been totally possible because it was there for the taking. But for both of them just kind of going through the motions and not wanting to take a chance, the public was not clamoring for either one of them to fight Patterson after that, even though they were deserved for it. Because who would want to see that? Like, really?
Yeah.
And you can have a guy like Rademacher come in, or a schlub like Tom McNeely, who's going to be guaranteed to run in there and try to knock Patterson's head off. So, like,
Medfield.
exactly, yeah, not good fighters
Snubby.
whatsoever. Not good fighters whatsoever. But they're not gonna hold back, and they'll try their hardest, and they'll get knocked silly for it, and that's what Customato wanted. So
Yep, that's true. No, that's true. And he did have a couple, and Patterson did have a couple of those kind of like Tommy Jackson firefights that like they weren't like good fighters, but they were at least they were entertaining. They were, I guess, you know, what the public wanted overall. But yeah, otherwise there were these. I mean, especially Eddie Machen's probably the best example of like cleaning out the division for Floyd Patterson.
yes,
Like
yeah,
he
man, he fought them all
he did
until
all the hard work for him.
he really did, man. He fought a gauntlet of guys at that point. It's a very whether the records are top notch or not, and a lot of people go on box record and be like, "Well, this one just had the record, and this one had. Like
Yeah,
Bob Baker had a record of 47-10 at that point. All right, who cares about the 10 losses? He fought a who's who of contenders and former champions. Like these were
excuse me.
good fighters that he was being matched with young. Like this was like within his first 20,
It,
30 fights, he's getting
that's
thrown.
somebody that you never hear about, because if you said
Totally.
Bob Baker, people would go, Bob who? But like
Johnny Summerlin, yeah, totally.
but in the wake of one of the issues of the ring after Marciano retired, in the wake of Marciano like retiring, and they're trying to figure out who's going to take over, there's like one of the issues has like maybe like 6 or 7 names across it, and Baker's one of them. You know what I mean? And so, and again, now people be like, who's that? But like at the time, they were looking at him going like, this is one of the guys who might, be the guy.
Totally. And then from there, unfortunately, because we just said Andy Machin is a guy that just kind of has bad luck, like Cleveland Williams, but it's just a different type of bad juju. Um, after laying
Oh
an egg
man,
against Zora Foley and, basically being blackballed now from getting a title shot at Patterson, both of them were for that matter, because they're like, who the fuck wants to see this? He kind of, his next best option, I guess, is to fight an unknown guy and to travel out to Sweden to fight Egnemar Johansson. And I'll let you take this one, Pat.
it's on YouTube. And wow, yeah, I
I
mean,
shouldn't laugh. I really shouldn't laugh because it's really bad. It's
it's
so bad.
bad. And on top of that, it's like one of those, it's like there didn't really seem to be a whole lot of padding on the ring. Like they were just like had some boards or some shit. So I mean, and Ingemar Johansson, not a super great fighter in terms of accomplishments. And I mean, like, a pretty good fighter in terms of the eye test or whatever is, when you watch him. He basically had a punch or two and was a good puncher, but also was kind of he belonged in that like Floyd Patterson category where like, he'd be a cruiserweight easily. He was not really a big heavyweight whatsoever. So, but I mean, first round, Eddie Machen, it was like he never really had a chance. I don't know if he had like jet lag. I don't know what happened to the guy. I have absolutely no idea. All I know was that Johansson caught him, hurt him. Eddie, and it's kind of almost similar to what was it, BoJack Ike Williams, where he gets like caught in the, caught against the ropes, and the ref's just like standing there. It's like, what? Go ahead, tee off, do whatever you want to do. And Eddie Machen's just sitting there, just bam, ba bam, ba bam, bam. And of course, now, whatever, let me think, maybe 5 years later at Madison Square Garden is, Benny Pretz dying in a very similar fashion against Emil Griffith. So, I mean, perhaps a couple years later, people would have been like, oh my God. But even so, you could see like fucking his corner, Eddie Machen's corner is like almost trying to rush into the ring, like, okay, ref, stop, please stop. And basically, Eddie Machen takes just an absolute ruthless beating, falls to the canvas. The ref sitting there counting him out as his corner's trying to revive him and going like, please go away, leave us alone. And the ref's just sitting there counting. It's awful, dude. It's terrible. Truly
It's
terrible.
so bad, bro. Like, you know, let me try to bring it up in this book right here. Like, it was just one of those things that when he got hit, all right, like he walks in and Johansson hits him with his right hand. I mean, it's a monster punch, and like you said, Johansson was very limited in what he did. And I believe even when he ended up fighting he was in the Olympics, wasn't he, Johansson?
I think so, yeah.
And he got like disqualified for like being skittish and just kind of like non-fighting, whatever it was. So like he came in like when you see a guy like that, and you're going back to like the late 50s, how much footage can you really see on a dude to know what you're getting in there with and
It's
know what's
true.
happening? You know what I mean? So like Machen probably thought this would have been a cakewalk, but like the first knockdown he gets hit with, he's already gone. Like he's unconscious. The fact that he somehow scrambled to his feet is incredible in itself. It's Larry Holmes, like when Larry Holmes got hit with Ernie Shavers. But unlike that time, when Holmes still somehow kind of sort of had his wits about him, Machen totally did not. Like he was gone. He was just a zombie who stood up, glassy eyed, staring ahead, and had no idea what the fuck just happened to him. And nobody on the planet would have ever, worth a conscience, would have ever allowed that to continue. But the referee in Sweden, who, probably had a shim sham commission back then and clearly didn't give a damn, let that go on. And so, first thing that happens, Johansson goes over there, boom, boom, hits him with another two piece or whatever it was. And Machen now is like unconscious, but not like unconscious, like he's like badly damaged where you should probably take him out on a stretcher and get him to a hospital for observation immediately. And instead, Machen's cornermen are in the ring feverishly working on him. And in the most surreal thing you will ever see, while they're working on him, Pat, and you've seen this, but like while they're working on him, fucking the referee is still counting. Like, how is the referee still counting? Like, there's a fight going on
Yeah.
when the corner is in there
I
pulling
I
out the belt.
probably in my head added way more punches than there actually was, but it's like it's almost like watching it in slow motion. You're
Yeah,
just like, what?
it,
How?
you know,
I
it was
yeah,
just
I don't you don't really see too many, you don't see too many knockouts like that for a reason. I mean, thank goodness. You shouldn't, because they shouldn't happen that way. But like, especially in like a higher profile fight, or yeah, it was bad, dude.
it was really bad, and that kind of just ruined his chances of really getting a chance at Patterson, which wasn't going to happen at that time anyways, because Customato was doing everything in his power to make sure that Machen wasn't going to get a chance at him. And so being a part of that era and being, even though he was one of the top guys of it, that just solidified that, that wasn't going to happen. So for whatever reason, Johansson, which you would think in D'Amato's eyes would somehow make him persona non grata as well for demolishing the number one contender, he ends up, like you said earlier, getting the shot at Patterson, knocking him out, and then dragging on that long trilogy. It was a fun trilogy, absolutely fun, but also very long and dragged out. And just
Yeah, kind
Johansson,
of
once he beat
needless.
Patterson, he took forever and made it was just bad. Yeah.
Yeah, kind of needless, and then it just tied up the rest of the division. And again, dude, again. So we're talking about 58, 59, 60, and here we are. Eddie Machen comes back from I mean, even coming back at all, period. That's something to behold. But he comes back 6 months later and just resumes his career. Doesn't go on like, a fantastic run, but goes on a very good run. He actually fought a lot out of the Pacific Northwest, and there's a guy who he defeated in one round who doesn't get talked about a whole lot, but was another contender right around this time that was talked about very highly, Pat McMurtry. Uh,
Yes, this is a good win.
and
Yeah.
he fought out of Tacoma, but fought out of, just out of the river over here in Portland a whole bunch of times, and was considered a pretty big attraction in Portland when he fought here. And in any case, Pat McMurtry got demolished by Eddie Machen. Eddie Machen didn't really demolish anybody, but that set him up for Zora Foley. And, I
Yeah.
mean, Zora Foley, dude, making the comeback. The guy's just all over the place too, and that's also just to show that Eddie Machen, Zora Foley, all these guys are fighting each other. Floyd's
Mhm.
not fucking fighting them, bro. They're all just fighting each other. He drops a decision to Zora Foley. At least Zora Foley gets a solid win this time, but he comes back, defeats Alex Mitev, and then winds up getting matched with Eddie, or I'm sorry, with Sonny Liston. And I remember this is one of the fights that they had been showing on ESPN Classic for fucking ever.
And
Like,
it's shit nothing because that fight sucked.
yeah, I don't know why. I don't get it. I never
I
understood
remember
it.
it too. Yeah, it
I
was like
never
it was
understood
only
it.
it was like there was a rotation of like 5 fights that they put on all the time, and that was one of
And
them.
that was one of them. And I never understood it. I was just like, okay, great. We get to
That
see
was
him
a
in
and
action,
that
but
was the thing. Like, unfortunately, that was a dreadful performance by Machen. He didn't fight. He wouldn't fight. He was on his bicycle. Liston just stalked him for 12 rounds and just kind of jabbed and whatever. Yeah, he went the distance, which is a moral victory. But if you kind of have to compare it with like, I mean, this is a deep cut here, but when Lonnie Smith fought Julio Cesar Chavez in the early 90s, you know what I mean? And like, if you remember that fight, Smith talked a lot of shit before the fight. Not saying Machen was running his mouth before Liston. I don't think anyone was that stupid. But um, Smith was saying he was going to do X, Y, and Z, blah, blah, blah. Immediately got on his bicycle. Chavez just stalked him and beat him up for 12 rounds, but Smith didn't do a damn thing. And yeah, it's the same thing. Like, you don't fight is going to make for a dreadful fight because the other guy is going to be forced to to chase you, and he might not be the most fleet of foot himself. So it's just going to make for
yeah, it was not a very engaging fight. But it really helped propel Sonny Liston toward, a point where it was like Floyd Patterson could no longer ignore him. He was kind of backed into a corner because he had defeated Eddie Machen and done it fairly easily. But Machen, from that point forward, he obviously continued on his career, but it got spotty very quickly after that. As far as his performances, the probably the best win he has after that is an undefeated Doug Jones, who also was not a very big heavyweight whatsoever and could have fallen into that big light heavyweight or small cruiserweight category. But he had a handful of engagements after. Oh no, yeah, I forgot about the Jerry Quarry win. I mean,
yeah, absolutely. You know, it was
I
like
forgot
he's
about that actually.
like Machen for a guy because we didn't even mention too that like outside of the ring, he suffered from mental health. Like he had a lot of issues going on from anxiety and I think just a lot of different things. And he spent a lot of time in the mental institutions for that too because of things he was going on. And also, as his wife said, he would struggle because he would feel like the inability to get a big fight, trying to maintain, support his family with the bullshit paydays he was getting back then, and yada, yada, yada. It was tough. It was really, really tough. And that easily could break the toughest person down to absolutely nothing. So, like, yeah, things would happen to him. And there's a chapter in the book Sporting Blood, but they mentioned during it. I'll read something right here. Um, on December 12th, 1962, this is just like an instance of what was going on with Machen. Machen was discovered sitting in his car on the shoulder of the Cummings Skyway by a police officer. The despondent fighter had a gun and a suicide note in the vehicle with him. Presumably, he intended to put both to use. Machen was arrested and taken to a psychiatric ward in Napa State Hospital. His wife told the Associated Press that Machen had been disturbed over money matters and failure to get a fight. He was trying very hard to get a fight with anyone. Fighting was his profession and he wanted to work at it. He was worried about family finances. Like, damn, you know.
And coming along several decades later,
Yeah.
perhaps he would have been taken a lot more seriously.
I mean, when dudes like John Ruiz being force fed down our throats, I'm pretty sure Eddie Machen could have made a nice little living on television,
Just
you know?
watch out,
So,
dude. His former attorney will come after you on
oh,
Twitter.
yeah, yes. But, anyways, to Machen's credit, after that happened, and that incident happened in 1962, in the end of 1962, um, he still, had his career going on, like you said, to the point where he was evil. He was able to finally get a title fight, not the main one that he wanted, but still, a title fight nonetheless for the vacant WBA title against Ernie Terrell. So it's like, you know, he still had some big fights in him, whether they were wins and losses, more so the losses of the big fights. He still, held himself as a contender. It lasted a long time.
He was right in there in that group when they had the bogus WBA tournament after Muhammad Ali had been stripped and whatnot. But he was still considered among that group when they were putting that tournament together. So obviously he was still viable as a heavyweight. It was just clear that, especially in hindsight now, we can see that he just never quite got over the hump. And now we obviously know there were a number of reasons for outside the ring reasons for that too. But yeah,
It was
you could
sad, and he ended up fighting Patterson as well.
that's true. Yeah, and I mean, obviously, and he unfortunately caught Patterson when Patterson had gotten rid of Customato and was actually fighting his ass off and turning in good performances, like
He
kind of
had something
somewhat
to prove.
badass.
He had something to prove, exactly.
Yeah. He
At that
unfortunately
point,
had to
was on
fight
the back
Floyd at
end.
that time.
Yeah, Machen at that point, unfortunately, was on the back end and really skittish with his career and had a lot of stuff going on with him. So it didn't end well for him.
No, it didn't.
And then, you know, it was sad. Like Machen's the end of his career. Like he became more of a trail horse opponent. Like he fought Joe Frazier, young Joe Frazier, and lasted a number of rounds before he got stopped. And then the end of his career, he fought another up and coming guy named Boone Kirkman, who went on to become a fringe contender and it's probably best known for being one of the members of the infamous Toronto Five that George Foreman was slapping around immediately after his loss to Muhammad Ali. But
Yeah, Charlie Polite, yeah, a bunch of those foos.
I mean, look, man, it was such a fiasco, but it's so like pro wrestling kind of like tinged that it's great. Like you see Foreman beating these guys. I don't want to call them cans, but he was beating these guys up, and you just hear Ali
Yeah,
ranting and
Ollie's ringside fucking
and
with
he's
him.
yelling, lay on the ropes, he'll get tired. And just talking shit. you know, and Foreman clearly agitated by it, but like, um,
we ought to we're gonna do a show about that.
oh,
Yeah,
we have to,
yeah. I
absolutely.
didn't even think
And
about
then
that until now, but we'll do a show about that.
Machen was another one though, who had another unfortunate ending, and this one is like kind of well, it's not talked about a lot. Like the one that another guy will bring up, I'm sure, in the next instance, like Zora Foley. His death has been discussed a lot over the years. Well, I mean, definitely back in like after it happened up until like the 80s, maybe even the early 90s. It's quieted down a lot over the years. But a guy like Eddie Machen had one just as kind of mysterious, I would suppose. You know what I mean? But it's never really been talked about. And again, I'll bring it up. On August 8, 1972, Machen was found dead in his pajamas after falling from his window in the Mission District of San Francisco. Whatever hex he suffered from persisted until his last moments. Machen lived on the second floor, and where most suffer from broken the most and where most might suffer broken limbs, fractures, or concussions from a two-story drop, the former number one heavyweight contender died from a ruptured liver. There has always been an air of mystery surrounding the actual circumstances of his death. Was it suicide or an accident? His girlfriend at the time, Sherry Tomasini, told officials that the troubled ex-boxer was prone to sleepwalking. Machen suffered from insomnia, a common byproduct of depression, and often took pills to help him sleep. It is hard to imagine anyone thinking a fall from a second-story window would prove fatal. Perhaps Machen was performing some sort of subconscious wish fulfillment when he stepped into oblivion that night. Perhaps he felt he had nowhere to go. I was a fighter for almost 13 years, he once said. It was hard for me to walk into something else after all that time. Machen was 40 years old when he died. Yeah,
Ay, 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 dude. Yeah. And I mean, it's crazy too, because that I guess is a pretty decent segue to talk about Zora Foley, since they fought a couple times,
absolutely.
and he himself had a very strange ending. But I mean, you know, I'm not trying to, well, actually, this shit, but I do remember reading about not that long ago that, and of course, now I just turned 40 a couple months ago, and I feel as though this is probably correct after, feeling myself age and shit, that some ungodly fucking percentage of falls, like accidents,
Yeah.
over 6 feet, 6 feet, 2 meters, 2 yards, 6 feet, are fatal. Like it's some shit like 80 something percent. And I was like, what? That seems like extremely high. But then I thought about it and I'm like, I'm trying to talk about like just like falling, like tripping. And I'm like trying to make sure I don't break my fucking arm just tripping to the ground and shit. And I'm like, yeah, falling like 6 feet and then like your entire body weight. And, I could guess I could kind of see that shit. So anyway, I'm not trying to
It's
like
scary, bro. It's very,
scientifically it's possible, but I mean I could see that if you fell the right way it could fuck you up. But
yeah,
still,
it's very scary to think about. Like imagining that you're that height. Well, like I remember because me living in New York City, I'm on balcony. I've been on plenty of balconies in my
yeah,
time,
I'm sure.
and I remember like my buddy, he lived in a small apartment that had a very small balcony, and like the height of the thing that was like blocking you from tipping over was not that high, and so I wasn't comfortable standing. I really wasn't that comfortable standing over it because it wasn't like we were actually sober when we were outside and on the balcony. Usually, it wasn't like sitting there. You know what I mean? So I would always make sure I was sitting on a chair, just sitting down like eye level to what I was doing. But I just remember one time we were like leaning over and looking over the whole thing. And I just like leaned over and I slipped slightly and I grabbed on. I just looked. I'm like, we were like 16 levels up or something ridiculous. And I'm like, dude,
Yeah, that's death.
yeah, it's instant. But you know, I'm not a height. I don't like heights at all. So seeing something like that kind of bugs me. I'm just like,
That's
Jesus
just like making like my palms sweaty and shit. Just you
Christ,
describing
think
it. I'm like,
about it.
ugh, fuck that.
Welcome to the city, man. But yeah, it was unfortunate about Machen. But this is a good, like you said, a good segue into another contender because they're all kind of snake bitten in their own way. Zora Foley.
Yeah, well, and they all just kind of intertwine with their careers, and again, a big reason for that was that Patterson wouldn't fight him, or at least wouldn't fight him in short order, and so they all wind up having to beat each other up. But Zora Foley, dude, he fought from 1953 to 1970, so I mean, it's not like he had a short career. He fought almost 100 times. Uh,
And unlikely, I don't have to cut you off, but unlike
yeah,
Cleveland Williams, he didn't have a break. Like Williams had a break for a couple of years after getting a shot, and then he had to rebuild himself up. Like Foley, I think, fought completely from that time period till the end.
yeah, he was a busy fighter. He fought at a fairly high level too, from fairly early on, kind of like Machen, where he was fighting a lot of the same kind of fighters overall, as that Machen was fighting. He had lost to young Jack Johnson, said young Jack Johnson broke his rib. I mean, it sounds in line with what young Jack Johnson was dealing out, but so he had a couple of early losses, but otherwise went on a fairly extended streak, where he went without a loss or without a big loss.
Yeah, another one of those guys that like back in the 50s and in the mid to late 50s, you had your middling contenders, you had your gatekeepers, and just tough guys. They had to go over the hump, like young Jack Johnson. I think Machen, not Machen, excuse me. We're talking about Zora Foley now. Zora Foley, I believe, for that fight, had an injury, pre-existing injury with his rib or something going on into it, and they told him beforehand that they didn't want him to fight, and he ended up going through with it, and because of it, like his injured ribs and Johnson being such just a brute and all the way he was, he got injured and ended up getting stopped because of it. But his other loss before that was a guy that we brought up before, Johnny Summerlin. who was another contender from that time period, who Patterson and D'Amato made sure that they had nothing to do with, because that would have been a fight that would have been a lot more tougher than, say, a we already said Tom McNeely, who was another middling contender. Cut and shoot Harris. There you
Yeah,
go.
Roy Harris. Yeah.
Roy Harris, yeah. Right. So notice a pattern here too, and I don't mean to bring the race thing, but like a lot of those dudes were just white guys too that like they would find.
Well, and like that's
Like
that old.
popular fighters, you know what I mean? Like popular fighters, and like Roy
Well, you
Harris
brought
and
up
stuff.
you brought up Jack Johnson earlier. I mean, and Jack Johnson knew that beating up on a white dude was going to be a lot more money than you know.
All right, look, Roy Harris wasn't a bad fighter compared to some of the others Patterson defended against. All right, Tom
He was
McNeil,
actually a pretty decent fighter. He's
I
just
mean,
goofy, but
exactly, yeah, cut and shoot. I mean, you got to play on him being a goofy Texan. That's fine, but like he was a decent fighter. Tom McNeely, not so much. Pete Rademacher was a decent fighter, but he was an amateur. He had no
yeah,
business with a heavyweight title as a pro. Um, Tommy Jackson was just an eccentric fighter, but he was decent. Like, you got to look at it. But these guys were not Johnny Summerlin. These were not Zora Foley. These were
yeah,
not.
these were actual good fighters.
These were like very good fighters that had a good chance of knocking Patterson on his caboose, as the late Keith Mullins once said. You know, so I mean, you move on. Like, he was fighting the same thing. Like, maybe not the same consistency as Eddie Machen, who was fighting top guys back to back to back. But like, he's fighting good fighters like Wayne Bethea. If you go through his record right now, Duke Sabadong, who not a top guy, but a dude who had been around the block and a really massive individual for his time period, all the way until 1958. Like you said, when he fights Eddie Machen, and they both just, you're like, damn it, like all you needed was one of those guys to really make an impact in that fight, because they both shown flashes of brilliance. And with Machen being undefeated and Zora Foley only having a couple of losses and both of them having, slight asterisks next to them, maybe it would be like, okay, this is going to prove the top guy. And they just blew it. If it's on your own discretion, it's on YouTube. I believe that first fight is on YouTube. I watched like 3 rounds and just decided I wasn't going to deal with it anymore. But if you can stomach it, by all means, go for it. But yeah, it was it was another one that, like, once something like that happens, he becomes Snake Man, because now the public's not clamoring for you to fight Patterson because you put on such an egg in that fight, and it's like, well, what are you going to do if you fight him? And from there, he's winning, but he's also getting kind of job too. Like, he knocks out the aforementioned Rademacher, who Olympic gold medalist, and in a big not even somewhat, like very controversial time, he was able to negotiate his way, which D'Amato was more than happy to oblige with, to challenge for the heavyweight championship in his pro debut. And so after, Patterson getting off the canvas was able to knock out Rademacher, he decided to continue with his career. Because I think at first he said that had he beaten Patterson, he was going to retire. He was like, yeah, I'm going to beat him, knock him out, whatever, and then I'll retire immediately. After losing, he decided to continue on, and he had a couple of decent wins, but anytime he stepped up, he got beat up. And this is one of the first times that Zora Foley, probably feeling a little resentful for getting passed up by a novice as a pro, decided to turn on the anger issue and beat the shit out of Rademacher and stopping him. So he had every right
yeah,
to, did you say?
hell yeah, dude. I mean, Rodemaker was like not a bad fighter, but this fucking pro debut, dude. Damn, like
He's like, I've been toiling along with almost 60 pro fights, fought everybody that needs that I've been thrown against, then screwed over, because he was just screwed against Henry Cooper right before that. Oh, actually, no, he's going to get screwed right after this fight. Then, like, things like that. And, he's like, what the fuck?
yeah, Henry Cooper, beloved British fighter even to this day, but also, for good reason. He won the Lonsdale belt outright 3 times, which is, I believe, still a record in British boxing. Still hasn't happened since then, and is probably unlikely to happen again. And he was the British champion, and I think for a time he was also the European champion, and that was at a time when those things actually meant something. And in any case, yeah, dude, he was also a good, hard hitting fighter. The problem was that I think in every single loss of his, he got cut to fucking ribbons, just to shit. I mean, great fighter, but man, if you touched him, he bled. and that was a big problem. It was a big problem against Zora Foley too. Zora Foley cut him up pretty good, and Henry Cooper wound up winning a controversial decision despite getting cut up.
Yeah, it was a bad one. I know that like that was one fight that Zola Foley felt reading a there's a book out there, like a small biography book that you can find. And Foley felt that, he got jobbed in that one. A lot of people did too. He dropped Cooper, like you said, he sliced him up. More or less, I guess, was in control more of the fight. And, being that they're in Cooper's backyard, he got jobbed. And that was the bad luck that followed these guys, you know what I mean? So at that
Well,
point, he knew it. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say that was kind of like that was the story of his career,
Yeah.
and it wound up also being kind of like how they characterized him after his death too. That he was like the hard luck guy, that he just
Oh,
had bad
totally.
luck.
So he strings off a bunch of wins after that. You know what I mean? Kept very busy. And until by 1960, who does he have to run into? The juggernaut of the entire era, Sonny Liston. And
Everybody got funneled to Sonny, dude. Poor
at some
guys.
point or another, because you want Patterson, but Liston wanted Patterson. And everybody I think kind of knew, all the contenders knew that Sonny was the baddest one of the group. Like they all knew it. And they all knew that at some point, since they were going to get a shot at Patterson, they were going to have to fight Liston, regardless if they wanted to or not. It just had to happen. And so, um, and all those guys that were like, we talked about them and they were more than deserving. Liston just trashed them like they were nothing. Cleveland Williams couldn't get to the third round against Liston, and Zora Foley didn't last much better either. There's no footage of this fight. I've read about it. Someone, I think on the old now defunct website boxing.com, someone had written about the fight and said that for 3 rounds it was actually really exciting because Foley like fought his ass off and tried as hard as he could, but he just wasn't going to do shit against Liston like any of those guys would. They're going to try. They're going to try their hardest, but
Yeah, I mean, in just you're running into a brick wall. What are you gonna do? You know what I mean? Like it is what it is, dude. And Liston was, I guess, the gatekeeper for far too long before he was the champion.
he's on
And
that Clubber Lang stuff, man. Like you're just going to walk into a dude who's just going to beat you into a bludgeon.
and he was hungry. He was mad. And he, he
Very
was
bad.
he
And
was
he deserved
mad.
he knew he deserved a title fight more than any of those guys.
And
And
he was not about to let any of them, whoop his ass on national TV. It wasn't gonna happen.
especially someone like Zora Foley. I love Foley to death, but I mean, Foley was just too mild mannered to do anything, and too much of a counterpuncher, quiet, laid back fighter to do anything against a dude like Liston. Like he was gonna be forced to fight. I'm sure he landed a couple of punches like Cleveland Williams did, and so on. But nah, man, Liston just treated him, just thrashed him like he did with everybody. You're gonna beat Liston in 1960, so that it was always like a little bit of consistency. He loses the Liston, comes back, and he wins a bunch of fights again, stuff like that, and then loses to all people, Alejandro Laverante, who another fighter who would have an ill fate, a few years after that. After he got killed himself in the ring, didn't he?
Yeah, he had fairly at the time unheralded Argentinian dude. But like not unlike Alex Mitef, there was kind of like small waves of Argentines that would make their way up or whatever. And yeah, Liverante just kind of came out of nowhere and got that win, and then a few years later got killed. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So, you know, like he was one of those guys. Like he was a long time contender because he just kept on fighting from there. Like what else was he gonna do? He's a family man. He had a family to support. He had a few kids. He had a loving wife, and this was his profession. He wasn't gonna go and do anything else. Like boxing was what he knew. And back then, Pat, like you can attest to this, dudes. Even if you would lose a couple of fights here and there, you would still considered a contender. You didn't have to be a top contender. You would still be in the top 10 though. Like Ring
Yep.
Magazine didn't drop you if you had lost a fight or two because you were so active, and all it took was just another win over a fellow contender, which was pretty common back then, to put you right back into the mix. And that's what happened. He loses to Alejandro Lavarante. He wins a couple of fights. Then he fights a rematch with Henry Cooper. Obviously, he's pissed off from the first fight that they had. So this time, in a rare showcase of his aggression, he knocks the shit out of Cooper in 2 rounds and just bludgeons him. and he's feeling good. So this the early '60s. He's still a contender, but he's stuck in a flux where how is he going to become champion? By this point, Floyd Patterson has been bludgeoned by Sonny Liston. Sonny Liston had already just knocked your dick, knocked you into next Wednesday. So how are you going to make this and like try to parlay this to become a heavyweight champ? It's going to be very difficult. But again, he's still just going to keep on plugging along and trying to get the paydays that he can. But the inconsistency shows up again because for a few wins, and then he ends up losing to a guy like Doug Jones. Doug Jones was a good contender, but it's like, and then from
For
there,
whatever reason, he and Doug Jones matched up well, and they made for like a good action. But like at
they
the
did
same
make
time, you
yeah,
probably don't want to make good action with Doug Jones. Like you want to be above that level.
absolutely. Like, yes, Jones was a guy that gave Muhammad Ali fits, and he fought for the light heavyweight championship, and fought a host of other contenders and Hall of Famers, whatever. But he was at that certain level where if you were gonna go in anywhere in your career and like really doing something and gonna step that next level, you were probably gonna beat him. It might not be like a dominating fight because he was a tough ass guy, but like you were gonna beat him comprehensively enough. And so Foley beats him, and then his inconsistencies himself gets up knocked out in the rematch. Is like, it shows you where his level's at. That being said, he still has a win. He still gets a win over George Chuvalo. He ends up beating a very young and raw Oscar Bonavena. You might have some input on that fight.
Yeah, I mean there wasn't really I actually haven't read the wiki on it, but I could tell you it's basically, Bonavena was cocky, he was undefeated, he had just come to the US, and on top of that, like people will I don't know if it's out yet, the Bone of the Ringo for Star Plus, the new series, but people will learn he bit Oscar Bonavena in the Pan Am Games in 1963, I believe. He wound up getting disqualified because he bit a dude named Lee Carr. And so he got disqualified. And after getting disqualified, he was suspended by the Argentine Boxing Federation. And so after he was suspended, he went to the US. And so
Mm-hmm.
he turned pro in the US and, thought he was hot shit, thought he was doing real great, and then ran into Zora Foley, who still had plenty left. He was definitely not, shot or by any means, and just basically walked Bonavena around the ring, dude, and just had his way with him, easily just whooped his ass because Bonavena had two left feet. He was really clumsy. He was kind of awkward, and he made that awkward style work for him in some fights. But at the same time, for like a classic boxer, he was pretty easy to handle. And that's exactly what Zora Foley did, was he handled his ass. And Foley had a few of those kinds of performances left in him. He Bob Foster, when Bob Foster was trying to periodically make his way up to heavyweight and say like, oh, okay, I got these light heavies handled, let me go up to heavyweight. Boom, nope, sorry buddy, get back down there. That
Yeah,
happened a couple times to him, and that was one of the times was Zora Foley wound up beating Bob Foster. So that set him up, against these kind of like B level guys, or I mean at the time B level guys, wound up setting him up for a shot at Muhammad Ali. A famous shot at Muhammad Ali in 1967. But as you kind of mentioned earlier, a lot of Zora Foley's story was that he was a quiet guy. He was a nice guy. He was kind of like, gee golly gosh, type of guy. And that was a little bit of the story behind the Ali fight too.
oh, absolutely. Like Ali was back then, Ali was at his most braggadocious, and he found a way to like antagonize all of his opponents and make fun of him and all this other stuff, right? And he couldn't say anything bad about Foley. While he couldn't, because Foley
Yeah, he
was such
wouldn't
a
play the game. Yeah.
wouldn't yeah Foley wouldn't play the game with him, and then I remember there was like, because it's again that I forgot the name of the book. I have it on my phone. I'd have to like find it, but like there was they go into they document the fight pretty, go in depth pretty well about it. But like a couple of things they talk about is that like in the pre-fight interviews, because this is still the late '60s, it's a little bit of controversy that Muhammad Ali changed his name from Cassius Clay to Ali. People still like play "What's my name" game, and yeah, and all that stuff, right? That was like a common theme with
and
opponents.
and reporters would jab at him too. Like they would say like, "Oh, so what do you think about this Muslim thing?" Shit like
Yeah,
that. They
yeah,
would be
yeah,
like,
yeah,
"Oh my
exactly.
god."
And Zora Foley, they asked Foley, they're like, so when Ali, they had a press conference and they're like, oh, what do you think about what do you call Ali? Do you think that's his name? And he said, what do you call him? He goes, I call him Muhammad Ali. And Ali tells him, he's like, yeah, thank you, brother. And Foley said something to the effect of, he was like, listen, Ali is a Muslim. He was like, I'm a Baptist. I believe in this and I do that. He believes in his religion. Like, I have no problem with what they believe. Like, he's cool. Like we all good. Like, I'm not, he was like, I have no qualms with what he's about or what he wants to do. And Ali respected him for that. Ali was like, he was like, Zora Foley is a very nice, he was like a very nice guy. He's been a long pro for a long time. He's so respectful every time. This is what he said. He said, every time I see him, he's always coming up to me. Thank you for the opportunity, champ. Thank you, Mr. Ali. I really appreciate you giving me a title fight. He was like, how can I get mad at a man like this? He was like, he's so sweet. And that's true. That was like his personality. Foley wasn't sucking up. He was just, for a guy they had been through so much, went through the Patterson era the way he did, been shunned, had to fight Sonny Liston and all these other contenders that no one else wanted to fight because Customato made sure that Patterson didn't have to fight them. And now at the tail end of his career, when he knows he's probably past it and is not going to have a good chance of beating an Ali at his absolute peak, and he's finally getting a title fight at Madison Square Garden, yeah, I'm sure he's still hyped. You know what I mean? Like, this is its own little Rocky story because he came from what part of Arizona did he come from? Mesa, something like that.
I want to say Chandler.
Chandler, yes, Chandler. You're absolutely right, Chandler, Arizona. And that's not a huge place. And he was one of their more popular residents at that time. So, like any place where you come from a small community, when someone like that wants a challenge for the heavyweight championship of the world, especially against a person like Ali, and when the title is still back then meant more than it did than any other time, you know what I mean? Like, that was a big deal. Yeah, you're gonna get the key to the city. Yeah, you're gonna get a lot of publicity going around. Yeah, you're gonna get the entire population around you rallying behind you. Like, it's big.
Yeah.
And Foley, to his credit, actually put up a decent fight against Ali. Ali was one of those guys that, like, especially back then, if he didn't have an agenda against you and you didn't really push his buttons in terms of him wanting to beat your ass, he would kind of fight to the level of how you fought. You know what I mean? Like, he would go through the motions and kind of play along a little bit. Eventually, he'd, like, get serious and take you out. But at the same time, for the first few
Yeah,
rounds,
he wasn't trying to humiliate you.
exactly, he would kind of go along with it and give you a little bit of success here and there. It was just almost until you decide to, like, really start pushing on the buttons. Then he's like, all right, time to stop playing, time to take your ass out. And that's what he did with Foley. And I think I told you about this on the BoxRec message boards, on the history part of the message boards. There was a thread that went about 3 pages long for some reason. People questioning if Zora Foley took a dive against Muhammad Ali when they fought for the title because of how exaggerated he fell when he was dropped. And it is an exaggerated fall. Ali hits him with, like, a combination. It doesn't seem like it's that hard, but it's solid enough. And Foley dropped like he was shot face first and just kind of laid there. You know what I mean? And yeah,
You
I
know,
think earlier in the fight he dropped like that too, and then kind of hopped up like randomly. So it kind of it looks a little weird. But if you look at
yeah.
other parts in his career, that's kind of how he got dropped, man. Like, he didn't take punches well. If he got hurt, he got really skittish, and sometimes he got fucking flatlined.
And too, there's also, like, I guess, different levels of, like, a dive or whatever. You know what I'm
It
saying?
was
Like,
definitely
there's,
not a
because
yeah.
it's like, could Liston have gotten up against Ali in the rematch? I'm sure. I'm sure. Did he
Oh,
want
there's
to?
one part.
Fuck no. He was like,
There's
bro, fuck
literally one
this.
part where you see Liston. He leans like he gets up. He kind of looks around while he's on the canvas, and then he sees that things are all chaotic, and you see him just kind of fall over again because
Yeah.
of it. He's like, what am I gonna do here? Like, oh.
Yeah. It's like, what? Why? Why? Why am I going to get up? You know what I'm saying? So, like, so does that mean he took a dive? No. And I think similarly, like, there are instances where, could so and so fighter have gotten up? Probably. Looked like the look on their faces that they could have gotten up, but they didn't. They chose not to. Whatever. You know what I'm saying? It's not me. But I get it though, and it can lead to situations where certain fights are like, oh, I don't know, it's kind of fishy. I don't think that's all that fishy, dude. I think it was just Muhammad Ali feeling, the fight was over. So he ended the fight. But
Absolutely, and it's sad because the same thing with Cleveland Williams. These were guys that should have gotten title shots years before that. Like he had no business. I mean, well, he had all the business getting a title shot in '67. I mean, he earned that, but he had, he clearly should have gotten another shot. I don't know, 7 years before that,
Yeah,
8 years.
he had almost 100 fucking fights, you know what I'm saying? And then I think that proof positive of where he was in his career was he came back and he kept fighting, but then he dropped a decision to Brian London. And with all due
Yeah,
respect,
that's
Mr. London,
really bad.
yeah, with all due respect, but I mean, dude, I've seen video. He's not a good fighter. He wasn't a very good fighter. So I mean,
No.
you know,
I mean, Brian London's most known for just getting obliterated by Muhammad Ali and others by then. Like, he's just, yeah, he was not
yeah,
good.
it came from a fighting family, bless him, but not a super great fighter. And so if you're dropping a decision to Brian London, I think that says a lot about where you are in your career.
Yeah,
Um, you know, and
at least.
for whatever
And
reason, Oscar Bonavena also wanted some revenge against him that he wound up getting, and at Luna Park too, the legendary venue in Buenos Aires. But still, you know, at that point, it was just kind of like I think it was just for formality. You know, I don't think that it really meant all that much to defeat Zora Foley at that point. You know,
no, because by the time he fights Mac Foster in 1970, Foster was the young. I mean, Foster had already lost to Jerry Corey, but he is also that young, super just monster puncher that was kind of wiping out the rest of the old stand-ins from the 50s and the late 60s, kind of guys like Cleveland Williams and Zora Foley, for example. You know what I mean? Guys like that, like Eddie Machin. Well, he didn't fight Eddie Machin, but I'm just saying, like those guys, they all fought someone from that era of like the early '70s that just like took them out for good. That was like, hey man, your past is in the past. It's over now, you know. And that was Foley's last one. You look at it, and it shows that I've never seen the fight. He got knocked down 6 times in one round in the first round. Like that's,
yeah, I'd say it's time to go.
I mean, not only that, that's just some brutal masochist like shit that you just. That's a referee that's just standing there with like blinders on his eyes, going, "Huh? Who's gonna allow someone to get a drop 6 times in one
Yeah,
round?"
how would that's yeah, that's a kind of a lot. How would what's the score after that? Fucking like ten
I
three.
don't even
Like,
know because it's 10-6 after if you get dropped 3 times, right?
I mean, I guess, yeah. I mean,
What is it? What would that be? 10-3?
it's like yeah, at some point you got to stop because it's just you can't mathematically win after.
So if
Yeah,
that was
that's
a
a lot.
hypothetically, if that's a 10 rounder, you'd have to win the next like 7 or 8 rounds to even like salvage a draw in that fight.
Yeah, you better not get punched again. Fuck.
Jesus Christ, man. ten
Yeah,
three.
yeah, it's kind of brutal. So I
Yeah,
mean, and you could
that
see,
was the end
yeah,
of it.
it was time for him to retire, but you know, his story doesn't end there because a
Not
couple
even close.
oh man, it's wild. I had to go look it up myself. It wasn't really that tough to find. The only the thing that was kind of tough to find because it was in a weird place was the autopsy report. So you can obviously see where this is going. But so the official story, according to the police, was that Zora Foley went with a childhood friend to a hotel, and his childhood friend, his childhood friend's wife, and his wife's friend were all having drinks. And at like 1 a.m., they went out to the hotel pool. They went to go fuck around, I guess, drink, go into the pool. And that at some point, Zora Foley went to grab his friend and throw him into the pool. And in the act of doing that, slipped and smashed his head on the side of the pool. And that one of the women had gone in running to the hotel manager to call the police or an ambulance, and that they did, and that they came, and that the hotel person had said that they saw several holes on Zora Foley's head, and that you know, the official cause of death at that time was some sort of, you know, blow to the head. But the discrepancy between what the hotel worker said about seeing multiple holes on his head was what raised questions.
Yes. Yeah.
And then so several days later, it took a while for the autopsy report to come out. Why, I don't know, which again also kind of makes it seem weird, but it's not necessarily abnormal. Sometimes it can take a bit. And the autopsy report said that officially he had one hole in his head and it might have looked like multiple, or he might have had blood or something like that. And that it was the single blow to the head that wound up causing some sort of like cerebral hemorrhage or some shit like that. And that's what killed him. But even so, it's just strange because he was apparently, as you said earlier, he was happily married, he had kids.
Mhm.
So nobody knows why he was out, and nobody knows why he was in the part of town that he was in. Nobody knows why they were at this hotel. Nobody knows why his wife wasn't with him. Like,
They found out. So that book that was written, you can, I think you can order it, or so I'm sure if you Google it, it's out somewhere. But like when I read it, and the guy who wrote it, similar to what you would do, Pat. You know what I mean? He became like a psychopath and just started went to a library and just started pulling through footage, like just microfilms of hours and hours of hours of stuff. Because you need it, because like you get it, man. You need to
at
get the
first, I
answer.
was like, similar to me, psychopath. And I'm like, no, that's true. You got it.
True, true.
You
Yeah,
got
and a
it.
good. I say that in a respectful, like a psychopath in a
Yeah,
good
yeah,
way.
yeah.
Like, not, you know what I mean? Like, you're there to get answers. Like, you're a fucking researcher, and that's a respectable thing to do. And being a researcher, especially a historical researcher, regardless if it's boxing or whatever, you got to do some dirty work, man. Like, and it's gonna be arduous, like headache like work where you're gonna have to go to some library or some back room where you're gonna get some dust allergy, and you're gonna have to pull through newspapers and microfilms and all kinds of stuff because what you're looking for is not really accessible, and you know it's there, but you just know it's going to take forever. And the people are just like, well, if you really want to do it, go for it. We need some spring cleaning, some spring cleaning anyways. Have fun. And the guy spent hours upon hours just pulling through films and night all these different things, trying to find anything that he could. And then he was finding these things. And then he finally found the police reports of what he was looking for, and like you said, the autopsies of what he was like trying to find. And it was like, and then from interviewing the family and all that, he started putting things together. And Zora Foley had a good friend. I think his name was Artis, was the first name. I don't remember his last name.
I think that was his name. Yeah. Well,
Artis was his first name. I'm not even looking at anything, but his first name was Artis.
I'm about to tell you right now, but go ahead.
And they were boys, whatever. And like you said, they were at a hotel that day. But what happened was Zora Foley, I believe in the book they said, put made a reservation under a different name. Was it
Okay.
Artis? So he put a reservation under a different name, and the reason why he did that is like you alluded to. Even though he was married with children, he was fooling around.
Yeah. Artist Broom.
Artist Broom, exactly.
Artist Broom was the
Yes,
dude's name. Yeah.
that was his friend. Artist Broom was, and what made this interesting too is that Artist Broom was a sketchy individual with a very sketchy past. The guy had a criminal record, had a lot of stuff going on with him, and if you look at Zora Foley, you'd be kind of surprised that you hang out with a character like Artist Broom. So that's what made it kind of like, what went down here?
Yeah.
Because
It's well, and that's almost makes it even like sketchier, in my opinion, because
like
it's
Broom
like,
wasn't a good dude. He wasn't a good person. There was a lot going on with him. I can't off the top of my head remember exactly all the things he was into, but it was a lot.
yeah.
It was a lot of backdoor stuff.
Well,
And
and the fact that Foley was so like squeaky clean, that's what I'm saying is that makes it even weirder. That I'm like,
well, also Broom seemed like, by all accounts, he seemed like the type of guy that if he knew he was going to be hanging out with someone that was like a minor celebrity like Foley was, especially in his town, you definitely want to cling on to him, become his boy. You know what I mean? Be known, oh yeah, yeah, I'm friends with Zorba, yeah, whatever,
yeah,
easy. Like Mike Tyson had them, everybody got their hanger-ons,
yeah,
and that became like Foley's bro though. So Foley, I believe, did an assumed name. He put himself under a different name because he was fooling around. And I think his son, Zora Foley, one of Zora Foley's kid, even said as much. He was like, my dad probably was fooling around. A lot of people were doing that back then. Even though you got a family, you got everything like that, still was happening. So they go to the pool, and Artist Broom's wife was interviewed because she was there that night. She talked about it. She remembered that. She remembered it. And
hmm
she said that, yeah, they were like fooling around at the pool. They were like kind of slipping. And then as he was trying to shove Artist in there, he slipped himself. And she said that in that pool there was like a divider in the middle of it somehow that like made like the lower end section, the bigger end section, something whatever it was, but that divider they think that's where he smacked his head on that somehow and like you know ended up
Yeah.
killing himself. But um it was just because of all the circumstances surrounding it, him hanging out with a sketchy guy like Artis Bloom was a former convict, him putting himself under a different name, so it was hard to find out where he was actually being located and what the hell was going on. There was so many things that like thank God there was still people still alive that could corroborate some certain things and clearly didn't have an agenda trying to like trying to push a narrative there. They were just telling the truth
Yeah.
that it looks like it really wasn't just an accident. You know what I mean? Just with a lot of like mystery surrounding it, but it was just a stupid act. Yeah, it was a stupid act. It was just a really scary, sad
Yeah, just an
accident.
unfortunate, unlucky accident.
Unfortunate, unlucky accident.
And
Exactly.
that's actually that exactly wound up being the narrative for his life too afterwards
Yeah.
when everybody was writing up,
And Pat,
uh
I guess you could say that for a lot of these guys of this whole generation, man. Just an unfortunate, sad accident with their life.
yeah, for sure. Absolutely. And I mean, one of like the little anecdotes that one local Arizona writer had told after his death in the paper, because like I said, I looked this shit up, probably not nearly as much as the author guy, but I spent like maybe about a half hour just looking it up for like, like about a week of time or so, maybe a little more. In any case, one of the anecdotes that one of the writers had said was that Zora Foley had been around for so long in Chandler and around this part of Arizona, was that when they had first hooked up, that this guy who had been involved in his early career at some point, Zora Foley's early career, they both went into some kind of department store or whatever, and this dude was going to go grab something, and he told Zora Foley, "Go grab a soda, and I'll be right back." And they were like, "We don't serve black people here,"
Mm-hmm.
and that was early on, just in his career, and that about 15 years later, about this was about the time of his death, about 15 years later, that same street that department store was located on was on Zora Foley Street.
That's awesome. And they actually they named a park after him too out there. I remember too.
So I mean, there probably aren't a whole lot of boxing celebrities out of Chandler, Arizona, but nonetheless,
Absolutely not. But I know people like he was. I think they still. I think that park still stands, or Foley Park.
like by all accounts, I'm not, I don't know, I'm not here to judge what if somebody's cheating on their wife or whatever,
Dude,
that's
that's the last thing I would ever worry about. And you know what? And I hate to bring up the Creed movies right now, but the fact that they made that like a weird narrative in the first film. Did you watch the first Creed film?
no.
It's okay, man. Don't worry
No,
about it.
you're not spoiling nothing for me. It's
I,
fine.
I, I know I'm not. I'm not even trying to, but like they they had a clip on Sports Center where they were like talking about, oh, so Apollo Creed cheated on his wife, and had Adonis and blah blah blah. So what does this mean now? What is this? How does this represent? Do we look at him differently? Like what? Every this is
I don't like it. I'm not going to celebrate it, but
no,
at the
no.
same
I mean,
time,
I'm just saying we can't act like
yeah,
this
yeah,
is possible. You know what I mean?
we can't act like it's unique either. Yeah,
Especially in terms of celebrities and sports celebrities.
yeah. Again, I don't like it. Not going to celebrate it, but
Exactly. I hate that. I mean,
what do
no,
you want
we're
me to
not
say?
going to celebrate that at all whatsoever. But sports celebrities, it's actually, I hate to say it, but it's rare when you find a guy who's faithful to his wife over the years, as opposed to someone who,
Yeah, as
gets.
much as these fools are traveling, and yeah,
Oh, please, yeah, man, come on.
yeah, it's bad, but it's not surprising. And so, I mean, that's
And
kind of
that
where
was that's how it ended with Zora Foley, man. And like yeah, there's a few like we said we could probably end up doing a two-parter out of this
I think
because
we're gonna, yeah,
we're
because
gonna have to, man. Because look how much we just
I,
covered on the three main ones right here.
I know I'd actually just now looked up at the clock and I was like, oh Jesus, we've actually, but that's often how it winds up going. We have a couple other of, things we need to catch up on as far as shows, but we're definitely gonna have to come back to this one
Dude, I mean,
for
they're
sure.
like we said, there's still guys like Nino Valdez. We still have to cover Sonny Liston, even though he ended up eventually becoming champion. He was probably public enemy number one when it came to being avoided.
Yeah,
So
the name of the game here is like how many of these fighters' careers, how much of their careers was lost because they were just waiting.
yeah, all of them. And that's what makes them a true lost generation, as opposed to the 80s generation where those guys were able to become champion, but they were
Yeah,
under
because the titles were just fucking going all over. Yeah,
everywhere. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And they became a lost generation more so because they were all under the control of Don King and
yeah, and
various
cocaine.
reasons of cocaine and yeah, it's the 80s substances, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
These guys became a lost generation because they were shunned from even sniffing at the title because of a psycho manager who made sure that anybody who with an inkling of talent that had a chance of beating Patterson was somehow aligned with the mob, even if they weren't, and therefore had no chance. And then you had all these other fighters being force fed down the public's throat to fight Patterson for the belt. And that's why Patterson remains probably the only heavyweight champion who had a better post fight career than he did as being champion.
that's true. That's a good point too. Yeah.
Which is crazy to think. Like
Fuck yeah.
most guys, when they're champion, that's when they're peaking in their career. Patterson had a better career as post fight champ, post career,
Yeah, yeah,
uh,
yeah.
as he did as champion, because that's when he decided, you know what, fuck custom auto, I'm out of that, and I'm gonna like show the public I'm not afraid of these guys, and went to the Lions Den and fought a lot of beasts.
Yeah, and had a lot of fun fights too. A couple of those were like fight of
Was
the
very
year level
successful
fights.
in them. And was successful in them. He beat Chuvalo in that fight of the year. He beat Bonavena before at the tail end of his career.
Yep.
He got robbed against Jimmy Ellis when he should have been the first three-time champion, for example. Like, yeah, man, Patterson was doing his thing. Ended up fighting Eddie Machin, knocked out Henry Cooper. Like, there was a lot of good fighters he beat during that time.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, dude. I mean, he kind of gets I guess we kind of gave him a bad rap. We didn't mean to. We're just trying to tell the truth.
Well,
But,
I don't, when
all
I
these
say,
guys got screwed.
yeah, we gotta put it like this, Pat, before we go. Like this generation, I don't want to put the blame on Patterson because he clearly proved himself to be a guy willing to fight
That's
anybody.
true. Yeah.
He was the one at the end that told not only Customato, but told America because the Kennedys and other ones, everybody else kind of like, confided in him, hey, don't fight Liston, don't do it, yada, yada, yada. And Patterson was like, no, he deserves it. And enough is enough. I don't want it to, like, he deserves a title shot more than anybody. I can't do this shit anymore. Like, we can't, deny this man. So to his credit, it's more so Customato. That's what I'm
Yeah.
blaming this all on. All right. This is him and his shenanigans because to a lesser degree, he tried doing the same thing with Jose Torres, but it kind of backfired on him when Torres lost to Dick Tiger. So
Yeah, for sure.
he
Well, and that's
thought
kind
Tiger
of
was an undersized washed middleweight, and he was, oh yeah, and then
yeah, found out the hard way that Dick Tiger is no joke, bro.
yeah, Tiger still was like, yeah, fuck around and find out, bro.
Yeah, one of the greatest boxing names of all time, and also a very underrated fighter.
Exactly. So.
For sure. Hey, dude. Well, I appreciate you, dude. We're gonna have to come back. We're gonna have to do a little bit more of this, but I appreciate you doing.
Oh, absolutely, man. I love my lost generation of heavyweights.
Hell yeah, man. Love that shit. But hey, everybody who listened in, thanks for first of all, for returning. I know it was a trying time, but we're back. I swear, we're back. If you listen in, thanks so much. Whatever podcast platform you listened in on, subscribe, leave us a rating, comment, those kinds of things. Much appreciated. If you watched on YouTube, hello, thank you. Also subscribe, comment, reply, etc. As far as social media goes, the Knuckles and Gloves podcast is also on. We're on Twitter, of course, but we're on Instagram and Facebook. I mean, we're on Twitter as long as it lasts. I don't know, dude. There's some weird new change every single day. I'm not gonna
And
fucking
man,
whatever.
I retweet your stuff. I retweet a couple of things. I'll
Yeah,
post.
I mean, if you talk to me, I'll talk back, but I don't know about all this whole thing. But in the meanwhile, regardless, we are there. So my boy Aris Pina is there's Punch Zone Aris, me, Patrick Connor, and there's Patrick M. Connor, and say hi. We'll say hi back. Aris, we'll talk soon, bro.
Good one, yeah.